Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. This is one of the busiest weeks in the art world. We've got auction houses happening and auctions coming up and exhibitions, gallery exhibitions going on. So everyone that's here, I'm deeply, deeply appreciative. It's a really, really busy time. Thank you to the Armory. Thank you to the Salon Art Plus Design. And thank you, Amelia, so much for helping to organize all this. I practically stalked you to make this happen, so thank you. I'm glad to be here. As you guys know, or most of you know, I'm Kim Heirston. I am not a specialist on Gilded Age art or architecture, but I am a very big champion of this gentleman here, Henry Wiencek. He's an historian, and he's written some of my favorite books, and he's caused me to go into a deep dive, so thank you, Henry. I first met Henry in December of 2021 during the pandemic, during the height of the pandemic, and literally, we found him. I was hunkered down in Long Island, and I reread one of his books, and this time, the second time around, really struck a chord, and I decided I wanted to meet him. So prior to that, during COVID, when I wasn't traveling to Europe or the Middle East or other places, I decided to take a road trip to the Deep South. And this was spurred in part by three things, really, kind of an astral convergence of things that happened. One was our president's comment that there are good people on both sides in the wake of the Unite the Right rally. I wanted to see the offending sculpture of Robert E. Lee, the monument that no longer exists. I also wanted to visit Monticello. I'd been doing a dive into Thomas Jefferson, and then I heard that Henry lived in Charlottesville, so I had to get there. And he very gracefully agreed to meet with me. It was, again, in the height of COVID. We sat outside on the terrace, completely masked in the freezing December cold, and but we became fast friends. So I'm just so glad. He was working on Stan and Gus at that time, and I think that was one of the reasons you were a little bit reluctant to take the time. But we became friends, and the book that really brought us together that I was reading during the COVID pandemic is this book here called The Heirstons, American Family in Black and White. And it's this extraordinary tale of a Scotch-Irish or Scotch patriarch, and it starts in the 18th century, and it makes its way all the way to 20th century Washington, D.C. with my cousin, Everlee. Henry was responsible for me reuniting with Everlee Heirston, who's this amazing woman, and I hadn't seen her for about 40 years. So we have this wonderful, amazing history together. I think of Henry almost as a fellow Heirston, because he's done so much to be a part of our family. But he's written two other major books, aside from The Heirstons, A Family Saga in American Saga in Black and White, which is a national book critic Circle Award. He's also written a wonderful book on Thomas Jefferson, Master and yes, exactly, and then An Imperfect God on our founding father and his relationship to his enslaved. And spoiler alert, he actually frees his slaves or attempts to free his slaves on his deathbed. So this is a subject matter that he's dealt with, but now he's turned to writing about Gilded Age America and or New York. And he's going to give us a wonderful slide presentation. I'm so happy that you are here, Henry, and we can do this in proximity to the Veterans Room, which is a Stanford White masterpiece. So thank you again, all of you, for being here, and we'll start with our discussion and slide presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kim, very much for that wonderful, generous introduction. It is interesting that after writing 3 books about the American South and slavery and the Civil War, that I'm writing about Stanford White and Augustus Saint-Gaudens and the Gilded Age. It's really not so strange at all, because for me it was a return to my own past. I lived in New York for 17 years. That's where I met my wife, Donna, who was sitting over there. And it was an emotional return to me. Actually, it was Donna's idea after I had written those books. Why don't you write about Stanford White? And there was a good reason for that, because when we both landed in New York at the same time in the mid 70s, and our first jobs were down the hall from each other at Time Life Books on the 17th floor of the Time Life building. And our courtship sort of began with long walks through Manhattan. She lived down on Rector Street and then on Christopher Street. I lived on West 72nd. And we would meet and just walk every Saturday or Sunday afternoon for hours and hours. At a time when the city was in the pits, things were falling down, the subways weren't working, the West Side Highway collapsed. But here and there were gorgeous survivals of the Gilded Age, these beautiful, ornate buildings that from an era of great, not just great wealth, but great confidence. And there was also a very, in some ways, which I'll get to in the talk later, a very strong sense of spirituality and heroism. And all of this we sort of absorbed together, and that really was one of the things that cemented our friendship and later relationship. I did some original research in Stanford White papers at Columbia in the 80s, because I was really interested in doing a study of him. And one of the funny things about landing in New York in the 70s from another town is that you heard the name Stanford White all the time. And I had grown up in Boston and had never heard his name. But living on the West Side, whenever I went to a party and people had a couple of martinis, they would say, "This is the Stanford White building." My building on 108th and Broadway had two little columns and a rusted wrought iron gate. So people said, "This is a Stanford White building." Everything beautiful in New York was attributed to him. He was like the old Roman god of grandeur. So I dug into his papers, and I realized that I was too young and inexperienced to make any sense of this, and put it aside and did a bunch of other things, and it finally came back to it thanks to Donna. And as we dive into the pictures, I'll say that an amazing theme jumped out at me that I didn't know was there before. The deeper I got into his papers, the more I discovered the presence of the great sculptor Augustus Saint-Gaudens. And I found, as some art critics had pointed out, that they collaborated quite a bit. But I found that they collaborated almost continuously for 30 years. And the collaboration was not just a professional one. It became a very deep personal friendship, and at times an erotic, emotional relationship with some pretty suggestive letters in the papers. And so I thought, here's a story that no one has really told before, and this is what drew me into spending more years than I would like to admit working on this story.
How many years, actually, Henry?
Well, no. It started around 2013, and we published this year. So,
right. Okay.
Yeah, but the pandemic came in, and there were other interruptions.
A little less than the Hairstons, right?
Yeah, right. So here are the two. And the funny thing about Stanford White is that many of you who've read about Gilded Age architecture have seen a picture of the three members of McKim, Mead, and White. These three grizzled, balding men. That was taken when they were in their 50s. This book is very much about the two young men, and here they are. I can't be sure, but I think Stanford White on the left was photographed at the top of 57 Broadway, a building that no longer exists, but that was the first headquarters of McKim, Mead, and White. And here is the young Augustus Saint-Gaudens looking, this extraordinarily handsome young man that there was a great story in the book about an artist in France seeing him on the street and falling in love with him and just following him through the streets and begging for him to get together, and they would then wrestling together and swimming together and embarked on this very interesting relationship, which I talk about in the book. This is a little scribble that Stanford did on top of one of their letters, which really gives you a sense of their relationship. There they are, rushing into each other's arms. They had a very deep need for each other. They really complemented each other quite a bit. Stanford White was the essence of ebullience, confidence, explosive creativity. Gus suffered lifelong depression. He was extremely slow, always doubting himself, and very often expressed a desire to take his own life. And Stanford really kept him alive and kept him going. And at one point, Saint-Gaudens said of Stan, it's like champagne having him around. He just lifted his spirits. And Stan got assignments for Gus. When Gus needed money, Stan would lend it, because Stan became very successful, as you all know, as an architect. And Saint-Gaudens, even when he was at the height of his success and fame in the 1890s, was still scraping for money. And his wife, behind his back, had to be borrowing money from rich friends. Here's the young Saint-Gaudens. He got his start as a cameo cutter down in the village, cutting cameos for Tiffany and some of the other high-end stores in New York.
And Louis Ave, he was at one point, and I always love that story because he talked about going to these incredible homes or these incredible stores,
yes,
and seeing these displays. And I really think that really had a lot to do with how he developed as an artist,
right,
and being very aware and that level connected very much with Stanford, who's interested in that kind of fantastic display.
Right.
But I'd love for you to talk a bit about their different upbringings, which I think is really interesting, and how they're shaped as artists, because they both have very interesting stories.
Yeah. You read my mind, because I was going to go back and say how Stanford, who was born in 1853, was born into a family of some wealth. His grandfather owned a clipper ship enterprise, and his father had enough money to study music, and he wanted to be a professional musician. But when steamships came in, his grandfather's clipper ship company immediately collapsed. And his father thought that he could make a good living as a freelance reviewer. Not so. He got a job at the Customs House at the same time that Herman Melville got a job in the Customs House. But Stanford grew up on East 10th Street in a very cultivated household. His father was a violinist and a pianist, and so he grew up to the sounds of Mozart and Beethoven, played by his father. Gus, on the other hand, who was born in Dublin in 1848, was the son of two really hard-working shoemakers, and they lived above the store on Lispenard Street, and later on 4th Avenue. But his father was a shoemaker. His mother helped to sew the shoes, and the funny thing was, his shoes, because his father was French, his mother was Irish. French style was very much in fashion in New York, so some of the leading families made the journey to his shop to buy shoes, and they always remembered this young man who would be in the corner sketching the workers. And later on in life, when Gus was actually launching his career, he would run into these people in Rome or in New York, and they would remember him, and they'd say, "Oh yeah, you're the young man who was always doing those wonderful sketches." And sure, I will. There was one man who saw that he had was working on a statue of Hiawatha, and so he offered to pay Gus to finish the statue, and that he would have it brought to Central Park and set up. It's now in the Englehart Court in the Met. So. Let's see the next one. This is the oldest known work by Gus. It's actually very important. You can see it pretty well in this. A woman came into the shop with a photograph of her recently deceased husband and said, I would like a cameo that I could carry around with me or set in a brooch, so that I would always remember the man that I most loved. And Gus sat down and made this figure, which really captures the life of this man. He had only the photograph to go with, but it brought out a skill that really was one of the things that defined Saint-Gaudens' work for the rest of his career, which was the ability to bring life to inanimate objects. This one fairly sparkles with life, and when we see some of the other work, you'll see how powerful it was. This was a very new thing in American art.
Can I add something here? I
Sure.
remember that he talks about seeing Lincoln well, first in a parade or a procession, and then he
Right.
sees a dead Lincoln. And the way he talks about observing the face and the characteristics of Lincoln, I think, is also just very telling about this man who goes on to be able to express emotion so beautifully.
Yes,
But
yeah. He was an intense observer of
everything.
everything, faces, clothing, and also actions. One of the great joys of his life later in the 1890s was going to a baseball game for the first time. And he couldn't believe how the men would leap and jump and throw in the air. It was just astonishing to him. And one of the first projects that they worked upon is the famous Trinity Church in Boston. There are a lot of stories attached to this, and I'm going to come back to that image in a second. The man on the left is John Lafarge. He was the mentor to both men. He was hired by Henry Hobson Richardson on the right to oversee the painting of the interior. And so he hired Gus, who was then living in poverty, sleeping in a packing crate in his studio on 14th Street. He hired him to come to Trinity to build the church. And actually, I should mention before I forget that that's where they met. Stan and Gus, as Hollywood would say, met cute on 14th Street because Stan was right near Union Square. He was walking down the street one day, and he heard the sound of a man bellowing melodies from a Beethoven symphony, and then later the serenade from Mozart's Don Giovanni. And Stan, of course, had grown up with this music, and he's wondering, where does this come from? So he ran up the stairs of the building that he was standing in front of. It was the German Savings Bank, and he comes into the studio of this impoverished young man who is at work making faces, making copies of Renaissance bas-reliefs of faces. And he's also struggling to make an image of a Civil War hero, the Admiral David Farragut. And he says, if I can just win the competition to make this statue, I will be able to earn my way out of poverty and marry the woman I love who's living in Boston, and I need her father's permission to marry, and I need a good job before he'll give that permission. Stan said, well, I'm an architect. I'm working with Henry Hobson Richardson. I will make a pedestal for your statue. And at that moment, a lifelong partnership was born.
And can we stop right there? Because I want to talk a little bit about both of them spending time in Europe. I know it comes a little bit later, but I do think that's so important that Gus goes and spends a lot of time in France, in Italy, and how that helps him flourish. And then later on, you have Stanford going as well at different times. But the European connection is what I think is interesting, and their love of music. I know those are big things to tackle, but I think they're both interesting.
Yeah, but Gus's father had been saving money. Gus's parents had been saving money without Gus's knowledge to send him to France to study.
To make an artist of yourself.
That's what they told him. Go to France, go to Paris, and make an artist of yourself. So he went over there and studied. He went to the École de Beaux-Arts, and then he spent time. He decided to. He was going to enlist in the French army when the Franco-Prussian War broke out, but he received a letter from his mother begging him not to go to war. So he changed his mind and went to Italy, which was a completely transformative experience for him, and that's where his work really began in earnest. So he had the advantage of a European education and exposure to the great works of the Renaissance before Stan ever did. Stan didn't go to Europe until many years later when Gus was making a second trip to Europe.
Right.
But Stan actually never had any training.
And Stan, no training, no high school, no college.
No high school. At the age of 16, he was hired by Henry Hobson Richardson with the intervention of Lafarge to become a gopher. And then he became sort of a traveling inspector, going from one work site to another, just tracking progress.
So it's
And then,
kind of
go ahead.
fascinating. I think just that the person who comes from the poor, more working class family, his parents are more encouraging. They're both encouraging in a strange way.
Yes.
Of their sons becoming artists, which you hear the proverbial stories about how parents don't want their kids to become artists. Not so now, because you can make a lot of money. But back in the day, to have them both so supportive, one with a lot of education, one without, it's kind of a reverse scenario.
Yeah, it was very, very, very unusual. And this is they were both working on the making of Trinity Church in Boston. One of the many interesting things about this, well, you probably know that this was the first building, the first large building erected in Boston's Back Bay, which was all landfill. It had been mud flats until this building was put up. So they had to drive tens of thousands of wooden piles into the ground to support this. And the building committee grew increasingly nervous about the size of this thing as it took shape. So they hired an engineer who said that the central tower will not stand. It's too heavy. This is going to fall down. So they went to Richardson and told him that, and he said, no, 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 it's fine. But the committee was adamant, the engineer was adamant, and so the whole project came to a stop until it was Lafarge who handed a photograph of a Spanish tower to Richardson, and Richardson then handed it to Stanford White, and literally overnight he redesigned the church with a new tower and handed it over to the building committee, which loved it, and it had the advantage of being not only beautiful but much lighter than the one that Richardson had designed. So it's one of the legendary moments in the history of American architecture.
On the less light side, you're going to tell us some of the mishaps, some of the dramas that unfolded, because there were many.
Yes, I was able to find a very rare and unusual document, the daily journal of one of the members of the building committee, which was laying in an archive in an obscure place in Massachusetts, and he recorded some of the accidents that took place there. I mean, toolboxes. They erected. Some of the men were working on scaffolds. Actually, Gus worked off a rope ladder in the middle of winter when the building wasn't even enclosed, and everybody was freezing. It was the temperatures went down as low as 9 degrees on some days, and tools fell, toolboxes fell, rocks fell. The minister of the church, Phillips Brooks, came very close to being killed when a gigantic stone, no, it was a box of tools, fell down from the top of the tower. But they did manage to get it done. Well, four men were killed in the space of a year and a half. And no, those are oh yes, this is the interior. That's the inside of the beautiful tower that Stanford designed. And on the far left, you might see a little dark circle, and it's one of the most obscure places in the church. Lafarge deliberately put Gus to work there because he didn't know how to paint. He was the only reason he got hired was he needed the money. And so Lafarge put him there where nobody could see what he had done, and it's one of the worst works in the church. So. And this is the statue that made them famous when it was unveiled on the same day in Madison Square. This is the statue of Admiral William Farragut that Gus was trying to conceive in his studio on West 14th Street when Stan showed up, and Stan said, "I can do the pedestal." That is Stan's pedestal. That is Gus's figure. This was a revolutionary work in American art. The New York Times said that the Renaissance has finally arrived in New York. There was immediately noticed by everyone who knew anything about art that this had a sense of vitality, of real life. It wasn't the rigid, cold, classicist style of statue that you can see in the other figures that are still there to be seen in Madison Square. The other interesting thing is that, or one of the many interesting things about this, is that when you look at all the curves in that pedestal, this is not so unusual to us. But this was the first time that elements of the Art Nouveau came to the U.S. in a public work. Stan had spent time in Paris working with Gus on this, and he noticed the beginnings of the Art Nouveau movement, which did not yet have a name, but he talked about the bucolic, alcoholic, lunatic, all the ick things, all these curves that he was putting into it. And he ran into some opposition from his own firm about the newness of all this, but they stuck with it. The other thing was the city bureaucracy refused to allow this statue to be erected when it arrived because it was so new. The city had a regulation that every statue had to stand on a plain granite base of a regulated size with no decoration whatsoever. And so Stan and Gus's work sat in a warehouse while an argument played out in the newspapers in their favor. And finally, the weight of public opinion forced the bureaucrats to allow it to be set up. And 10,000 people showed up to see it unveiled. And from that, and I think the headline in the Times was the triumph of Augustus Saint-Gaudens, and they all also pointed out White's work.
So it's the first example of a collaboration of this kind in America, and as we know it. And I was saying earlier today that Brancusi, Constantin Brancusi, is always given credit for being the person who really enlivened and changed the nature of the base. He comes along a little bit later, and with some of his seminal works being around 1901, 1902, The Kiss, 1907. But the point is that this is what I love about history, art history, and what I do is the fact that you keep changing. It keeps changing in terms of who was first at doing what. And so really, I think this first collaboration, first installation, we get further into the idea of installation and experiential art. Now we have Van Gogh, surrounded by Van Gogh, but it really kind of starts the idea that the architecture and the art and the base and the way you look at a work is dictated by an architect in this collaborative process. So I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, you realize when you approach this, and in the book I described the tremendous effort that Stanford went through to pick exactly the right spot for this, the place where the light and shadow were the best for the figure, what class of people would see it. He thought this was in the sweller part of the park. Actually, it's not in its original location any longer. But Kim is absolutely right. This was really the first work of art that created the sense that you are in the presence of a work. That with the setting was very, very, very carefully designed, right down to the approach. And here's one of the bas-reliefs there's a sub-story here too. Gus tried to get his sister-in-law to pose for this, which meant that she would have had to pose in the nude, so she decided she didn't want to do it. And this is their personal emblem, a crab, which is it's in the pebble dash approach right to the statue, and it says that their names: Augustus Saint-Gaudens, sculptor; Stanford White, architect.
And the pebble dash, where does that come from?
Oh, that comes from a church that they saw, the Church of Saint-Gilles in southern France, a Romanesque church that they visited, and Stan fell in love with the design. It's a triple arched facade. He reproduced it for the church that's now standing on Park Avenue, with the Goodhue building and the Stanford White archway.
St. Bartholomew?
Which was originally downtown, but the arch was moved up when the congregation moved. So some family background, that is Saint-Gaudens' wife, Gussie, on the left with their only son, Homer, and on the right is Davida Clark, who was Gus's mistress, in the face of many of his monuments, which we're going to get to in a moment. She was an 18-year-old Swedish immigrant when she came through his studio door looking for work as a model.
She never left.
She never left, yeah. And this is Stanford White's family. This is his wife, Bessie, their only surviving child, Lawrence, and a monkey on Stan's shoulder. And this is Stan's perpetual state of mind, his ebullience, electricity, and
a little bit Sun King, I said.
Yeah.
But I want to just go back to talk a little bit about the ladies, because you make
sure.
make a point of that in the book. You start off the chapter saying that Gussie and Bessie are very similar in many ways, and one aspect is they were pretty earthy creatures, but also I think that they both had some money, something to bring to the table. For sure, I think Stan was more interested in that in the end. But anyway, it's interesting.
The stories of both of their marriages are interesting, and I devote a lot of attention to the relationship between Saint-Gaudens and his wife, Gussie. She was very ill for much of her life, and of course she outlived him by many years. But she was very shrewd financially. She took care of his business affairs, and when things were getting very, very grim, she wrote a letter to his good friend Charles Lang Freer, who would later be the founder of the Freer Gallery. He was a railroad car magnate, asking him for advice on how to handle the outpouring or the lack of money coming in and the immense amount of money pouring out of Gus's studio, because he had so many assistants and so many jobs going on at the same time which were not paying. And instead of offering advice, he sent her a telegram saying, "I've opened a line of credit for $36,000 for you at the Bank of Detroit, the checkbook to follow." So that rescued them. But it was, Gussie knew at some point that she had to reach out for help. Bessie and Stan lived largely apart. Bessie lived in the family house in Long Island, which still stands. It's called Box Hill. And Stan is famous for all of his affairs with young actresses. Bessie had her revenge. She had a long and very pleasant affair with Stanford's lawyer. And she was also the heir to one of New York City's big fortunes, and she was very careful to keep her money separate from his. And so when things went bad financially for Stan,
he still borrowed liberally.
I'm sorry?
He still borrowed liberally.
Oh yeah, I think he ended up owing her over $100,000.
And found himself, for their enormous popularity and fame, they both went through bouts, particularly towards the end for Stan, of being in poverty, or at least with Stan owing a lot of money to people. So just fascinating. And I think the underlying story throughout the Gilded Age, there are fortunes made and fortunes that disappear and collapse.
Yeah.
Of course, if anybody's watching the series, you're seeing that.
Yeah, Stan is in the first episode, the first season of the Gilded Age, and he designs the house for the Russells. The funny thing about him is that in the show is that he's too old. He looks nothing like Stanford White. He's very reserved. He has none of the ebullience that Stanford White had in real life. And Mrs. Russell makes the interesting comment that he's the only architect who had studied abroad, which is completely untrue. But it fits her character because she's the kind of boastful person who would say an untruth like that. So it's truer than the truth.
Whatever it took to up Lady Astor.
Right. Yeah. Let's see. And there's ebullient Stan, and there is all the ebullience across the hall of his design sense. The Veterans Room was the work of Louis Comfort Tiffany, Candace Wheeler, Frank Coleman, and George Ewell, the earliest members of Associated Artists. Louis Comfort Tiffany approached Stan and asked him to be the consulting architect for this. And you can see this is the perfect thing for Stanford White to do, because he was so eclectic, so many different elements, so many different media work together so perfectly, and it has a very strong, unified emotional sense. It's very masculine. When you look at the details, it's very warlike. The frieze across the top goes all around the room, and it depicts scenes of battle going all the way back to the ancient Greeks. And one of the things that I love is those two very masculine columns in the room, which Stan had wrapped tightly in rusted chains, which the veterans of the regiment had saved from the Civil War. And Stan was watching as the workmen were tightening these chains, and he kept saying, "Pull tighter, tighter, tighter," and they scraped off all the rust. So Stan just had faux rust pointed on, so the idea of the antiquity would still be there.
And just so you know, if you stick around after, we're going to be allowed into the room, the veterans room, to spend a little time with Henry there.
Yeah, and you'll see all the interplay of different shapes, materials. It's just one of the best spaces in New York. And here's another one. This is the French consulate. Stan did this for Payne Whitney, the Payne Whitney family, and it's called the Venetian Room. But I love it because it reminds me of a scene in Edith Wharton where she's talking about a ball where all of the people at the ball can see themselves reflected in the mirrors around the room. don't we look gorgeous in our jewels? Don't we look gorgeous in our clothing? We are a magnificent horde. And here, he really makes this into a reality. He did a lot of work for the Payne and Whitney families, and there's a funny story which I put in the book. His Payne Whitney called him the king of Europe. He sent him a letter and saying, here is a check for $30,000. I want you to go and buy the best art you can find. And he named some art, a Gainsborough, a Turner, a really good Turner. And he said, everything you buy has to be better than what you bought from my uncle. So,
and as an art advisor, everyone asks me, does anyone ever give you just to, say, here's, $10 million, $20 million? And I was like, no.
Yeah, right.
It doesn't work that way.
Actually, the $30,000 was one of the smaller checks that he got. So, and here's the interior of the Metropolitan Club, which was another one of White's great achievements, for the leading plutocrats of the town. But he could also work with Gus in a much more simplified and direct psychological vein. Well, actually, here, this is the Villard houses, which are not too far from here. This was originally designed, Stan started out designing this house in a Romanesque style. He went on a long trip with Gus, and when he was away, the firm gave the assignment to a young man named Joe Wells, who designed this very severe, quite severe Italian Renaissance building. And that marked a decisive shift in the work of McKim, Mead, and White. From this building on, they were known for their Italian Renaissance work. And the reviewers who described this building were able to detect the difference in the psyches of Joe Wells, who did this severe exterior, and the man, Stanford White, who did the interior.
And just want to take a second to talk about the state of American architecture.
Oh, yeah.
Because you really put it beautifully in the book. Like, there is no real American style at this point. And you've got a bunch of disparate architectural firms that have flat files of drawings of medieval arches and Doric columns and pyramids, and they just kind of it's a pastiche and a cliche and really the worst. So here is where you start to get like more of a refined, it's still looking at the Renaissance, but more of a refined, sophisticated synthesis.
Absolutely.
As opposed to crazy pastiche. And it is interesting to point out that MIT is the first architectural school in America in 1968. 1868. University of Illinois 2 years later, 1870, and Cornell. So we're really at the very, very beginnings of a real architectural school.
Yeah, when the Gilded Age was really beginning to take off, and there was a tremendous need for architects, there were only 3 schools in the U.S. So people who had studied abroad were in demand, and the three schools that were already in existence emphasized classical architecture. One of the young architects who got work at McKim, Mead, and White was Cass Gilbert, who later designed the Woolworth Building. He was Stanford White's assistant, and he fled the program at MIT because he said that his brain was just cramped down with their demand for strict classical architecture. And the building that he most loved in Boston was Trinity Church. He used to go and watch it. He didn't see it built, but he would go and just admire it week after week because it caught beauty in stone. It had an emotional power to it, which the classicists refused to admit. That was one of the things that got Stanford in trouble for the veterans room across the hall, because some critics said it had too much feeling. We don't want feeling. We want precision.
Purity.
Yeah. So this is the exterior that was done by Joseph Wells. This is the exuberant interior that was done by Stanford White. And you'll see the clock there on the wall. That is a joint project that's called the Zodiac clock. It's still there. This was co-designed. It was built by White and Gus together. It's still there. It's really one of the glories of the city. And the critics of the time caught the difference in the psyches of the designers. The interior was this bold, exuberant, joyful thing, and the outside was so severe. The funny thing was, Joseph Wells was beloved by Gus, and the two of them had a very powerful emotional and a sexual relationship. There's a note in the files written from Gus to Joe Wells saying, it's written in French, my girl, my most beautiful girl, you alone I love, I see you and my heart dies of love, something to that effect. And we'll get back to Joe Wells in a minute. Stanford built the settings for some of the city's greatest celebrations. Here's his Washington Square arch with an immense throng of people. Probably it's some 4th of July celebration. The picture is undated, but he was the maestro of parades, fireworks, all kinds of celebrations, and this was the site for many of them, still is today. This is one of Gus's well-known statues in New England, and Joe Wells had a hand in this. This is called the Puritan. He was hired by a very prominent New England family, the Chapins, to make a tribute statue to their ancestor, the Reverend Chapin, who was a Puritan, and they wanted to put it in a park in Springfield, Massachusetts, in the Irish neighborhood, to give an example of good old New England values to the trashy immigrant Irish families. Well, when Gus really couldn't figure out how to do this, and he and Joe Wells used to hang out at a bar on Broadway around 10th or 11th Street, and Wells said to him, "Why don't you make a parody?" Because Wells was from Boston. He came from an old Brahmin family, and he hated that background. He said, "Make a joke of the guy." So you can see he's got his big overfed belly sticking out. He carries a Bible like a weapon, and he's got a stick in the other hand. So I mean, this is the the brutish Puritan on his way to beat some woman. So, and here is again life brought to clay. This is a bust of General Sherman, who retired to New York, and Stanford had the idea of getting him together with Saint-Gaudens so that Saint-Gaudens could make a bust of the general. And this is what resulted. And here you can see the face ravaged by war, and this is the face that you will see if you can look closely at the Sherman Monument at 60th Street and Fifth Avenue. And these are some of the black troops that fought under Sherman. This is the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the all-black regiment that fought heroically in South Carolina, and half of them were either wounded or killed in the matter of hours. And Saint-Gaudens was hired to make a monument to them. And at first it was just going to be an equestrian statue of the commander, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. But the family didn't like that idea because they said Colonel Shaw was just a colonel. You got to be a general to have an equestrian statue. So they sent Saint-Gaudens back to the drawing board, and he wrote down that he had the idea of associating the colonel with his men. And he said the men became more and more important to him, and he became very passionate about expressing. He could have done this in low relief, but he did it in 3 dimensions. People disagree with counting the figures in here. There are 16 or 18 figures in an incredibly complicated composition that he spent years doing, and Stanford argued repeatedly with the committee and lied to them about progress to keep them from firing Gus.
And the way he models the black figures is really astonishing, because he goes out on the streets looking for people that he thinks are interesting, and black men, and has them come back to the studio. Some are a little afraid that something weird might happen to them, but it's an astonishing story of his desire to get at the truth and to have these real individuals be there in this frieze, and it's just so powerful.
Yeah, after he finished it, he had it photographed in Manhattan, and a black man who worked in the base as the furnace keeper in the building of the photographer came up to see the photographs that the photographer was taking, and as he looked, it turned out he was a veteran of the 54th, and as he looked over it, he said, "Yep, those are the boys." That Saint-Gaudens had really captured them. And this is the introduction to one of the most powerful works that they did together. In the 1890s, Henry Adams on the right, the writer and diplomat and very wealthy Boston aristocrat, came to Saint-Gaudens' studio and said, I want you to make a monument to my wife who has died by taking her own life. And that's Clover on the left. This was a very toxic project for Saint-Gaudens because, as I said, he was very depressed and he very often thought of taking his own life. His first practice sketch or maquette for this was a figure of Socrates holding the cup of poisonous hemlock. And when Stan saw it, he said, no, you can't show that to Henry Adams. And so...
appropriately, it went black.
Oh, it did? What happened?
Don't know.
I don't know. No, we still have time. Dan, are you there?
Oh, there we go.
There we go. And
But great effect,
yeah.
guys.
So what he came up with, the other thing that Henry Adams said, he said he wanted a Buddhist statue because Adams, like many upper-class Bostonians, had rejected Christianity and was very interested in Buddhism. Gus took that idea and took it in a whole different direction and made this mysterious figure that he always referred to as just the figure. It is neither male nor female. And here's another look at it. There are so many elements to this. One is what Kim was talking about before. This is one of the most powerful instances of the art installation in our country. Stan surrounded it, created an outdoor room, which you enter from the side, and you see this mysterious hooded figure. There is nothing on it that says it's a tomb, and the one of the most powerful things about it is that he embraced not only the Buddhist idea of shifting genders, male shifting to female, female shifting to male in a deity known as the Kwanon. As he was working on this, his lover, Joseph Wells, very abruptly and horribly died. And in the week that Joe Wells died, Saint-Gaudens was seized with his worst episode of make, destroy, make, destroy, make, destroy. He wrote to Henry Adams begging for more time because he said, I've demolished the figure several times. And he wanted Adams to come and give his approval to the face, but Adams refused to look at it. And from the very beginning, people have said, and the reviewers said, every visitor has said, they cannot tell if this is a man or a woman. And my own feeling is that Saint-Gaudens put his personal anguish into this statue. It is both male and female, and I think that the underlying message is that love has no gender. No, that's backwards. Mm-hmm. This is Stan as his life begins to go off the rails, hanging out with the richest people that he could find. Nothing wrong with being wealthy, but he does things like this. He sponsors the pie dinner, where he gathers some of his wealthy friends and artists and architects, and he hires a 15-year-old girl wearing much less clothing than is seen in this drawing, which appeared in the newspapers, after each of those gentlemen had consumed about 4 bottles of champagne, a giant pie was brought in and set on the table, and this 15-year-old girl jumped out wearing nothing but some kind of gauzy outfit. The other famous collaboration, which you've all heard about probably, is Diana, the statue of Diana, on top of Madison Square Garden. This was Stan built a pedestal for Gus's statue. This was the only nude that Gus made. And here is
and it was controversial.
And very controversial at the time. But New Yorkers embraced it.
Yes.
But people, there was, the funny thing about it is in Philadelphia it said that it was an example of the depraved artistic taste of New York.
An example of people who probably hadn't seen it.
Right.
Weighing in.
Yeah. And now, the one you see on the left is an 8-foot reduction. What is on the right is 13 feet tall. The original was 18 feet, and they had to take it down because they realized it was just too big, and it was supposed to swivel, and it was too heavy. So they took it down, and they redesigned it. Gus redesigned it to that gorgeous figure, and then there was an 8-foot reduction, which is at the center of the Englehart Court in the American wing today. The Englehart Court is virtually a shrine to Saint-Gaudens. And here is a look at the 13-foot version, which is ironically in Philadelphia.
And they love her now.
Yeah. And I'm about to finish, but do you have anything else you want to
No,
bring up?
I just wanted to bring up the fact that there were so many different, not so many, but a number of iterations from 18 feet. So just imagine that. Like, I'm 6 feet, so 3 times that.
Yeah.
I think at one point she weighed close to 2,000 pounds.
Something like that,
that.
yeah, I forget.
And for someone who was so unbelievably so much a perfectionist, kind of got it wrong in the first iteration. But want to point out too, in this case, you have a building that is the sculptural base, going back to Brancusi, who I love. But that's just such an that's also absolutely innovative and was amazing, and must have been amazing to behold. And just to add, you have the advent of electricity.
Right.
Stanford was such a theatrical master. And he loved to light things in a way. Before that, you didn't have your monuments lit in the same way that he did. So this, by all accounts, was just such an extraordinary, magical figure. And I wish we could see her in her original.
Well, and her face is that
Is
of
of
Saint-Gaudens'
Davida.
mistress, Davida Clark. The story that is in the book and that emerged from the papers is a lot about art history and the history of architecture, but it's really an emotional story. It's the story of these two men who had an extraordinary collaboration and a very powerful personal relationship. Go ahead.
I actually did want to add one thing, because I just think it's really ironic that you see this incredible, colossal female standing with all these suited men. But Diana, as we all know, was the huntress.
Right.
And she eviscerates her tormentor. And so much of the stories that we hear, and particularly as we get to Evelyn Nesbit and the other showgirls who were sort of passed around in Pie Girls, for Gus to have done a woman who represents absolute female strength is just interesting.
Yeah.
It's one of his complexities, right?
Yeah. The image I would like to close on, which is also at the Met, also has, no, I keep going in the wrong direction. This has the face of Davida as well. And this is one of his, here is the story.
The story.
I
You all
forgot.
know the story,
How could
right?
I forget this?
Should we go into the story?
Yeah, well, Stanford raped Nesbit when she was a 17-year-old girl, and several years later, she married an insane, drug-addled millionaire named Harry K. Thaw. And when Harry K. Thaw realized that he had married a woman who was not a virgin, he questioned her, and she said that it was Stanford who had done the deed. And so one June night in 1906, when Stanford was in the rooftop theater of Madison Square Garden watching the premiere of a new musical called Mamselle Champagne, Harry Thaw walked up to him and pulled out a pistol and put 3 bullets into him, and he died instantly on the spot. And it was international news.
Wasn't there a song about kissing 1,000 girls playing at the time, or is
That's
that a
right.
myth?
They had,
Is that a myth?
I could love 1,000 girls.
I could love 1,000 girls.
Right.
As he's bleeding out.
Yeah. And according to the New York Times, as he was lying there in death, a woman dressed entirely in white came over and kissed him. So, and that's Harry K. Thaw on the left and Evelyn in the center. I want to end with a powerful and a very positive message from Saint-Gaudens. I told you that he suffered from depression his whole life, but he said to a niece that I fight against it by making images of love and courage, the beautiful things. This is, one of these is in the Louvre, this is in the Met. This is his image called Amor Caritas, love and charity. This is really the strongest message that he wanted to pass on to posterity.
Nice. So. And on the note of love, I'm just going to mention, because I didn't in the beginning, as I said I was, that I think that this book on collaboration is a little bit of a love poem to Donna, because they're terrific collaborators. Donna is also an historian, and she's just wrapping up a book right now called Victoria's Island. about a secret hideaway on the island of Wight, and it promises to be just as juicy, and I can't wait to read it. But I wanted to also mention that when I first met Henry and Donna in Charlottesville, Donna told me a story, and I asked permission to share it. But she wakes up one night and she finds her husband literally submerged, covered with documents, research papers, all sorts of probably microfiche in boxes, and he's actually there saying, "But I need to find the name." And I think at the time you said you thought maybe that the book, and this is the Hairstons, maybe had driven him a bit mad. And but the story for me touched my heart, and I realized that how serious and committed Henry is to finding the truth and trying to find the real stories and tell those stories. And at that moment, I realized that Henry is a superhero, and in an age where we're all subjected to twists on the truth and virtual realities and warped realities, to have truth tellers amongst us, they're going to save the day. So thanks so much, Henry, for everything you do. And now, any questions?
No charge.
We've just covered everything so brilliantly that there are no more questions. Has anyone seen the girl on on a red velvet swing? Because I kind of recommend it, even though you're probably cringing. But it's a kind of a whitewashed example of the Thaw murder and Evelyn Nesbit. But we like to play around with who we would have cast or who could be cast today in the role of ingenue. But it's actually a very pretty film, even if it's not historically accurate. But read Henry's book. We have some copies to give you, and Henry's going to. I don't know if we have for everybody, but Henry's going to sign them, and then we're going to go over to the veterans room and see Stanford's masterpiece. And thank you again, Amelia, for everything, for the last minuteness of this all. Thank you.